Faces and chapters from the Central European legal heritage. Welcome to the Central European Legal Insights, the podcast series introducing the professors of the Central European Academy at the University of Miskolc through insightful conversations with Judit Varga.
In this sense, returning to our roots in terms of law and embracing the principles and values derived from Christianity is essential for Europe's survival. However, in the European Union, the concept of the rule of law is used against the sovereignty and the independence of EU member states. I repeat, ultimately we must preserve our sovereignty and our independence, security and prosperity for our present and future generations.
Welcome to Central European Legal Insights, the podcast series of the Central European Academy at the University of Miskolc. My name is Judit Varga. I work as a senior mentor at the Academy, and I will be your host in this podcast. In each episode, we would like to present the faces and the personalities of the Central European Professors Network, and through the friendly conversations, we would like to bring you closer to the rich diversity of Central Europe's legal heritage. But also, we would like to explore the stories and ideas beyond science that connect us in this region. With this, I warmly welcome in the studio Professor Dr. Przemysław Czarnek, former Minister of Education and Science of Poland in Budapest, and he is also member of the Sejm, the lower house of the Polish Parliament, and he is a member of our Professors Network, working as a university professor at the University of Lublin. Welcome to Budapest, dear Minister.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for inviting me.
We are going to discuss very interesting issues of the Polish constitution and also some alternative forms of the European integration, like the very successful format of the V4, but also future challenges of the 3Cs initiative, of which Professor is an expert too. But before coming to the professional topics, I would like to explore your professional and personal background. So please tell me about your curriculum. How did you become a constitutional lawyer? Especially, why did you choose the academic path of your career besides being a politician? And also, how did you come across the Central European Academy?
It was, one might say, a twist of fate. I always wanted to study at the Catholic University of Lublin. The university was an oasis during the communist era in Poland. I moved to Lublin and graduated there from law because I always wanted to be a lawyer. However, I also dreamed of becoming an academic. I wanted to stay at the university and become a professor of constitutional law. Before the war, constitutional law in Poland was called political law, state law, which meant it related to what interested me most, namely the life of the state, the community, the nation. This law has the greatest impact on human reality, hence my interest in constitutional law.
So throughout your academic career, you experienced also the difficult times of the church in Poland, and maybe being a constitutional lawyer and professor, you can also see what are the future challenges of, for example, Christianity in Europe.
It seems that we are facing what Benedict XVI described as the end of Christianity in Europe. Christian Europe no longer exists and will not exist, Benedict XVI said in recent conversations. It can be said that the future of Europe in this regard appears to be very difficult because Christianity is the foundation of Western civilization, Latin civilization. Without Christianity, with some different civilizational circle, Europe will no longer be Europe. This is what John Paul II said at the beginning of this century. Europe, in the third millennium, will either be Christian or it will cease to exist. In this sense, returning to our roots in terms of law and embracing the principles and values derived from Christianity is essential for Europe's survival. We cannot predict whether we will succeed, but we do have a solemn duty to fight for it to happen. Not for ourselves, because we already have lived a little in this Christian Europe, but for our children and grandchildren.
It's not a question. I just would like to add a remark to this, that whenever I am in Poland, I am confident and I'm certain and I'm convinced that as long as we have Polish Christianity, we will have a Christian Europe, because I'm always impressed about the popularity of the church still today among many generations in your country. But dear Minister, I would like to ask you about your story with the Central European Academy. How did you get in touch with us, and why did you choose to work with us?
I think this is something we tried to do in Poland, but we did not have the same conditions as you in Hungary, and I'm glad that it has been successful here. What we need in Europe and in Central Europe is something like the French Grande École, not just for Hungary, not just for Poland, but for Europe as a whole. The Academy trains PhD students who come here to conduct their research and develop skills to later serve Europe, particularly in terms of its conservative Christian roots and values, which are of extreme importance. After realizing this and talking to the then Hungarian ambassador to Poland, I decided that cooperation with the Central European Academy is indeed very important for me and for my country. This is because this Polish, Hungarian and other international research networks in the area of the Visegrad Group, and more broadly the 3Cs initiative, are particularly important for the future of Europe, and that is why cooperation suits me very well.
We are very happy to have you among our professors, and as you are one of our partners and already participated in a working group of the Polish-Hungarian Research Network, if I recall the elderly research, the care of the elderly people in our countries in Central Europe, you also realized that one of the backbone principles of the cooperation at the Central European Academy is the respect towards each other's national diversity. And this is why constitutional identity is the central element of many research topics. So let's move on to the constitutional identity field. And I would like to ask you about the Polish concept of constitutional identity, because you are a constitutional law professor. And what do you think, what distinguishes the Polish constitutional identity from that of other Central European countries?
I believe that the genetic code of the Polish constitution, as enshrined in its fundamental constitutional principles, whether directly or indirectly, is the genetic code of natural law. Although the term natural law does not appear in the Constitution itself, Article 30 and the reference to human dignity as the source of freedoms and rights clearly indicate a connection with natural law. This connection is also reflected in the opinions and statements of the Constitutional Tribunal. Our law, constitutional law, and other legal branches that derive from or are consistent with this constitutional law are rooted in natural law. Therefore, we have an indisputable connection between what we call jus and lex in Latin, which is necessary because today any attempt to replace natural law with international law is doomed to failure. This is a shift away from the values derived from Christianity, which are reflected in the Polish constitution. I do not know if this distinguishes the Polish constitution from other European constitutions, but it is certainly a defining feature of the Republic of Poland's constitutional identity. It is one of the best aspects of the constitution. Although improvements are needed and work on the new constitution is required, however, this area of constitutional identity must undoubtedly be replicated in future constitutions.
This sounds like a really unique aspect of the Polish constitution. If you look at the history of Poland's constitutional deeds, what is the earliest deed, what is the earliest documentation in history which qualifies already as a footprint or blueprint for the Polish constitution? I give you an example, like in the Magna Carta in England, or in Hungary in 1222 we have the Golden Bull. And later on, I will tell you why I asked this question. If it's not a compulsory question, it's just, if you like.
Pierwsze dokumenty konstytucyjne.
The first Polish constitutional documents date back to the Middle Ages, and these texts have been preserved. These are only so-called constitutions. These are the most important laws that also regulated the legal status of the Polish nobility. However, the first written constitution is our constitution of 3rd May 1791. It is the first constitution in Europe. A few months later, the French adopted their constitution. But the Polish constitution was the first European constitution written in 1791, 4 years after the 1787 American constitution. It is indeed a reason for us to be proud. The Constitution of 3rd May contained legal principles which were transferred in a slightly modified form 100 years later to the March Constitution, after the period of partition. But the tragic aspect of this constitution was that even though we remember it as a great monument of Polish and European law, unfortunately it contributed to the fall of the Polish Commonwealth. But these are political issues, and it is not the fault of the constitutionalists who drafted this constitution. There were certain political circumstances that contributed to the collapse of the first Polish Commonwealth. In any case, this is what distinguishes Poland on the map of Europe. It was the first country to use this type of legal act with the Constitution of 3rd May. Later, unfortunately, we were absent from the map of Europe for 123 years. In the meantime, there were constitutions granted by Napoleon, the Constitution of the Duchy of Warsaw, and by the Russian Tsar, the Constitution of the Kingdom of Poland. But these were not Polish constitutions. Later, we returned to constitutionalism in 1921 and 1935, and then went through a period of communism, just like Hungary. Or quasi-communism, which was not real communism. Again, our constitutions were imposed by foreigners. In 1952, for example, it was Stalin who gave us a constitution modeled entirely on the Soviet Union's. However, our 1997 constitution represents a return to making certain sovereign decisions, even if it has its flaws.
Nawet jeśli mamy w niej błędy.
We should dedicate a whole podcast episode to the history of the Polish constitution, but the reason why I asked this question is because in the very fashionable rule of law debates and discussion at European level, we often hear the distinction between new democracies and old democracies. And as a former minister of a Central European country, I always refused this kind of distribution, this kind of classification, especially in light of this rich history of Central Europe's national constitutions. And this is why I actually ask like a provocation, because I don't think we had to invent democracy after the fall of communism. As you also mentioned in your answer, it was a revitalization of the already existing principles that for some time, because of political constraints or power games in Europe, could not be realized in the daily life of our nations, but they already existed many hundreds of years before. And with this answer, we can now bridge to the rule of law concept. You often hold lectures to our students at the PhD program. And do you think there is a different concept of rule of law based on the Polish constitution, especially in light of today's challenges? We often hear press, or not, unfortunately not enough often hear news from the actual political issues of the Polish public life, but rule of law often comes in the discussions. I have spent many years sitting next to the Polish minister in the Council of European Ministers when the infamous Article 7 procedure was on against both of our countries. Today, the Article 7 procedure has stopped against your country, if I'm well informed. So how do you see the actual concept of rule of law, based on all the actual political happenings in our country, but also based on the recent criticism.
There is a huge problem with the rule of law. The rule of law is a bit like democracy. It has been completely distorted and hollowed out by lies. The rule of law, from German legal culture, von Moll, Stahl, is exactly the same as it used to be at the very beginning. The rule of law means that the government is governed by the law, not the other way around, that the law is governed by the government. And that is how it should work. However, in the European Union, the concept of the rule of law is used against the sovereignty and the independence of EU member states. Hungary and Poland have both experienced this. The fact that the Article 7 procedure was blocked or terminated does not mean that previously there was no rule of law in Poland and now there is. On the contrary, today there is no rule of law. Today the law is being violated. Today we have a so-called militant democracy. Today the current Prime Minister says that he will apply the law as he understands it, or he will not apply the law if it conflicts with his, as he put it, values, which has nothing to do with the rule of law. Today the rule of law is a catch-all against the sovereignty of countries such as Hungary or Poland, against the sovereignty of every country, including Slovakia, which has just changed its constitutional provisions and was immediately attacked by the EU elite without any legal basis, again using the excuse of the rule of law. In other words, I am very concerned that something that is an achievement of European legal culture will be completely destroyed by this way of conducting politics and treating the rule of law. It will be so badly damaged that we will have to find a new way to bind those in power to the law. Something similar to what happened to people's democracies has happened to the rule of law.
Stało się z demokracją ludową na przykład.
To this phenomenon, with the Central European Academy, we might contribute with the achievements of the recent Professors Network book called The Reverse Rule of Law, because the recent challenges in Poland to the constitution and to the rule of law, we established this working group where Polish professors, also constitutional lawyers and judges contributed to. So based on all that, do you think there's a real need created for a constitutional reform in Poland, or even a new constitutional concept to eliminate such damage to the rule of law or to the constitutional order?
To nie jest kwestia reformy konstytucji.
This is not a matter of constitutional reform. It is a matter of the first pillar and the condition of the rule of law in general. The first condition for determining whether a given state or organization is governed by the rule of law is to establish that the law applies there. Since today's government does not apply the law, and they themselves say that they will not apply it, they are essentially destroying the first pillar of the rule of law, and constitutional reform is not enough here. Conclusions must be drawn and consequences imposed on those who do not apply the law. There must be sanctions for those who directly violate the rule of law. And this has nothing to do with constitutional reform. Constitutional reform in Poland must take place for different reasons. The Constitution established a completely absurd system of government, unknown in any other European Union country, which we called rationalized parliamentarism with elements of presidentialism. It is something between a presidential and a parliamentary cabinet system. Poland is the only country in the European Union where regulations do not specify clearly who represents the country at the European Union or NATO summits. In Hungary, there is no such problem. It is perfectly clear that the Prime Minister, as the head of government, represents Hungary. In France, it is the president. In our country, however, it can be either the president or the prime minister due to the combination of two systems and the creation of something that we can call a weakening factor for the Polish state. Since when there is a constant struggle for power, the state cannot function effectively. So from this point of view, constitutional reform is necessary. But when it comes to the rule of law, it is not a matter of constitutional reform, but of taking action against those who are violating the rule of law today.
I understand now. It's like the typical Kissinger question, whom shall I call if I want to call Europe? Whom shall I call if I want to call Poland? And is this issue a topic of the general public discussions, or it's rather debated among politicians or academia?
It is increasingly becoming a discussion that goes beyond academic, parliamentary and political spheres. Since the tragic Smolensk accident of 10th April 2010, which was also a consequence of this fatal system of government, people have begun to see that this system cannot continue to function in this way. The issue of the rule of law is also beginning to go beyond academic and political spheres, which probably needs to be discussed more often. It is clear that for the average person, everyday life is more important than the issue of the rule of law. However, average citizens are also beginning to understand that the violation of the rule of law is starting to have a direct impact on their everyday life, their family, their children, and themselves. Therefore, it seems that the subject of the rule of law, but also the subject of the need for changes to the constitution, a constitutional reset, as some of our friends call it, is beginning to be discussed more widely and not only in academic and political spheres.
Yes, we have to take into consideration the nation's everyday needs, irrespective of theories. And in order to change now the topic to the future of the European Union discussions, I would like to mention that you assumed the role of being the leader of the new working group of the Polish-Hungarian Professors Network, which will focus on alternative forms of integration. Because when we are discussing the future of the European Union, it's necessarily also the future integration models are part of this discussion. So how do you see which forms of integration would be most appropriate and suitable for the Central European region? So irrespective of the currently existing forms, and what challenges associated with the process of European integration lie ahead of the Central European region?
When it comes to the European Union, we are at a turning point, and a very sharp one. On the one hand, it has given us peace in this part of the world, and no bombs have fallen here for 80 years, thanks to its creation. First as the European communities, then as the European Economic Community, and even later as the European Union. On the other hand, it is beginning to slip off the trap of economic cooperation and peacekeeping. On the contrary, it is also becoming dangerous in this regard. We, Poles and Hungarians, still need it, but we must have more influence on its activities and the possibility of pushing forward sound and sensible solutions. From this point of view, this cooperation, first of all between the Visegrad group, Poles, Hungarians, Czechs and Slovaks, who clearly have a common interest in this part of Europe, should perhaps become the foundation of something we are working on in this research network of Polish and Hungarian professors. Something we call the 3 Cs, Trimarium, or more broadly the Intermarium. If we take this broader perspective into account, there are over 60 million people living in our 4 countries alone, which is already a significant number. This makes us, the members of the Visegrad Group, one of the European Union's largest partners. And if we take the broader Intermarium region, it will be about 120 million people, which means that it is already more than a third of the entire European Union. Our impact on the European Union would be positive. If we have alternative forms of cooperation within the European Union, we do not have to leave it. Our influence on what is happening in Europe would indeed be much greater, which is why I am very pleased that here in Budapest, in Miskolc, in Warsaw and in Lublin, we are working on researching the future and significance of alternative forms of cooperation in the European Union, primarily in the area of the Three Seas initiative.
Before we go into the more in-depth discussion on the Three Seas initiative, which is a very exciting one of the alternative integration forms or ideas for that, so do you agree with the statement that these alternative forms are like subsidiary initiatives that support the whole European project, or they are individual alternatives to the EU?
Może być i to, i to.
It can be both. First of all, it would be a form of cooperation that is intended to support the European Union in its functioning. But we also have to have a certain alternative for cooperation in this part of Europe, where we have a certain community of common interests. In case if it were to turn out that the European Union wants to go all the way and hit a wall, because it is impossible to change the European elites and replace left-wingers with conservatives who are connected to our civilization and its principles. In short, above all, it should be something that will actually support the European Union in its normal functioning and influence its decisions. But perhaps, if it is not possible to stop the Union from self-degradation, then this will be an area in which it will be possible to independently build our economic area and our community of values, not only on the margins of the Union, but outside of it.
Could you please share a few words about the Intermarium project, Intermarium alternative? How does it look like? Who are the member states of that? Is it institutionalized? And what are the roles for Poland and Hungary?
To na razie jest oczywiście w fazie jeszcze...
For now, this idea is still in its infancy. It was initiated by Professor Lech Kaczyński, blessed be his memory, President of the Republic of Poland, and it was further developed in 2015-2016 by President Andrzej Duda and the President of Croatia. At this moment, it does not yet have much significance. For the development of the Intermarium, it seems that the rebuilding of the Visegrad Group's role will be important. Trimarium has to be based on this as well. However, if we now look at all the states of this Trimarium or Intermarium area from north to south, we find that we have many features in common. We are all countries that are considered to have emerging democracies. We are developing states. Yes, we have the highest GDP growth, and our infrastructure is becoming increasingly modern. Our states are part of the Western civilization, but the region is a gateway to the East and to what we call Byzantium. Our countries can be easily connected by road and rail infrastructure, enabling faster economic development in our region. Finally, we are states with a conservative Christian identity that remains very strong. Of course, this is also changing for the worse, but we are still very strongly embedded in this circle of Christian culture. In this sense, we can influence Western Europe to prevent the prophecy of Benedict XVI from coming true, that Christian Europe will no longer exist.
You referred to the V4 format, and I have a personal experience with the functioning of this institutionalized cooperation in Central Europe. And I do believe that despite political differences, the core values of the Central European region, when we talk about the social and economic background and the historic roots and the geography itself, always guarantee the survival of this formation, if not the highest political level, but still on the basis of the institutionalized cooperation. And Poland being a relevant member of both alternative forms of cooperation, I mean the V4 and the 3Cs initiative, can also function as a link. And you mentioned the Scandinavian and the Baltic area, which in my views can also easily connect the whole region from the Nordic to the Adriatic region and also the West Balkan. And this is why we Hungarians, where we are very, let's say, dominant in the V4 format and always played a key role in cooperating, forming good alliances when new European legislation, for example, came up, and we could cooperate practically and pragmatically very well. We are able to link in the Western Balkan countries, even they are just a candidate region, but it's economically and also politically crucial for the future of the whole Central European region. And you, as Poland, you can link in the Nordic states or the Baltic area. So this is why the Hungarian-Polish axis in any forms of alternative cooperation is very, very crucial and relevant based on my experience. And again, the more institutionalized cooperation format is, the better chances it might have that it may survive actual political differences in the government. What is your view on that?
At the end of the day, it is about our states being able to enjoy full sovereignty and independence. We, you today, we until recently, but hopefully very strong, again, can demonstrate an effective struggle for this idea. That is full freedom to the extent that is possible for our nations. Our community of ideas and actions should form a basis for developing the V4 format and more broadly for establishing these connections between us and the North and between you and the South, to create an area in which sovereign nations and independent states function excellently, primarily cooperating in the economic and commercial spheres based on the values proper to our civilization. The experience of Hungary, which we have observed for over a dozen years and which has developed exceptionally while holding on to the roots of Western civilization, and our experience from the 8 years of United Right rule, could be a very good foundation for the 3Cs initiative. I repeat, ultimately we must preserve our sovereignty and our independence, security and prosperity for our present and future generations.
Let me repeat your statements, which I really like. You mentioned independence, sovereignty, common values, which are rooted in our Central European tradition, and the pragmatic cooperation. And I would like to add the voluntary nature of cooperation. So it's not an obligation, it's a very pragmatic-based alliance. This is also my personal experience with the V4. If you start to lobby for your national interest, you have to have friends, especially at the beginning. And 60 million inhabitants or 60 million citizens, it's quite something. You can already can create a counterweight vis-a-vis big founding member states of the Western European or of the Western European Club. But then by the time you get what you wanted, you can easily get out of this coalition. No obligation, no force to stay within that alliance or within that coalition. This is how I saw the V4 plus format in operation. And it was very, very successful, especially on issues of industry or trade policy or environment, especially the waste management dossiers of Brussels were really dividing the continent in two halves based on the habits of the citizens, how they deal with the trash, how they deal with the waste, especially with recycling. And you cannot force measures on nations, on countries which are not yet inherited with the everyday habits. So this is why we need to cooperate. We need to find the most appropriate format for the cooperation, but all based on those principles of subsidiarity, sovereignty, independence, pragmatism, and voluntary nature. And here maybe the V4 plus format, which can be extended without any limitation. Even Austria joined very often, especially our fight against GMO production or GMO agriculture or GMO-free agriculture. I think we should continue working on these alternatives, and thank you very much for being with us in the next working group of the Central European Professors Network, which you will be leading, and I do hope that in 1 year we have a beautiful book with valuable contributions.
I also hope that this cooperation will lead to excellent scientific discoveries that will show the enormous value of creating these alternative forms of cooperation, because that is precisely what it is about. For some time, we Poles were unfortunately fed the false idea that we could no longer look after our own interests, that European interests were more important than Polish ones, because we are united and we must get rid of our egos. This was said by the very same people who are among the greatest egoists when it comes to looking after their own interests. The French, for example, and they are not wrong to do so, the French president, Jacques Chirac, even said that we had lost an opportunity to remain silent. We do not want to be quiet. We want to look after our interests, our national interests, in the sphere of our states, because then we show that we respect ourselves. If you want to be respected, then first you must respect yourself and show that you have, first and foremost, respect for yourself and for your own interests.
Dear Minister, Professor Czarnek, I couldn't agree more with all what you have said. I would like to ask again about your personal experience and maybe some of the achievements, either as an academic or as a politician, which you are the most proud of, what you have achieved in your career.
Ja myślę, że ta
moja kariera naukowa, my academic and political careers are the result of something that has always struck me and guided me, a lack of complexes. I never had any complexes. I completely overcame them during my work in Italy in the 1990s. I remember meeting an elderly man who was about 90 years old. As it later turned out, he had fought alongside General Anders's soldiers, our Polish soldiers, who had traveled from the south of Italy all the way to Bologna. He was a rather rough man and said something to me, "Essere Polacco è un onore." To be Polish is an honor. I'm convinced that a large proportion of Poles, I do not know about Hungarians, suffer from complexes. These complexes hold them back and prevent them from developing. My academic and political careers resulted from the absence of these complexes and my desire to show all Poles that they can and must be proud, not only of history, but of the present too, so that we can pass this pride on to future generations. They too want to be proud and aspirational and develop. I devote my academic research at the Catholic University of Lublin to this, whether in the area of the rule of law or economic freedom, the latter being the subject of my habilitation. I also devote my political activity and my role as a minister to this by creating programs such as Discover Poland and Discover Poland, the family country, which aim to replace the so-called pedagogy of shame with the pedagogy of pride. Unfortunately, we were driven into these complexes by the policies of a state managed by liberal left elites, and I'm committed to changing this. The aim is not to feel superior, but to recognize one's own value and develop the state and our part of Europe for future generations. Andrzej Duda, the President of the Republic of Poland, expressed this sentiment beautifully in 2016. We are here for a moment. In this relay of generations, we are only passing through. We have taken over the baton, and soon we will have to pass it on. What we are doing now is our duty towards those to whom we will pass it. This is something I hope shapes my academic and political career.
I think it's no surprise why the Hungarian and Polish souls are so close to each other. So thank you very much for this very, very nice example, what it means to be proud of being a citizen of or a member of a nation. Coming back to the Central European Academy, why would you recommend for your students to come to join one of our PhD or LLM programs? Why it is unique, if it's unique in your eyes? And is there any added value represented by the Central European Academy comparing to other already existing think tanks in this region?
I can only reiterate, at the moment, this is probably the only place in Europe, and certainly in Central Europe, where such training is provided on this scale. It is a top-tier training ground for the countries of the Visegrad Group, and more broadly, the 3 Cs initiatives, Hungary, Poland and others. This is the only place where we have an absolute academic freedom. In today's leftist world, which has largely taken over higher education institutions and the world of culture, places of academic freedom such as the Central European Academy are rare. That is why I encourage anyone wishing to develop their academic career or scientific research in law to study here in Budapest. As I hear from students during lectures, including today's, there are enormous possibilities here. There are a multitude of conferences and international meetings, as well as opportunities to publish one's research results at an early stage in an academic career. This is a huge opportunity for all of us. I hope that we will be able to strengthen our cooperation with your academy in particular and demonstrate to Europe and the world that this is where development, freedom and real scholarship lie. That is the search for truth. Because scholarship is nothing other than the search for truth. If people are forbidden to search for the truth and limitations are imposed on them, as is the case elsewhere, then they are not practicing scholarship, but nonsense. At the Central European Academy in Budapest, there is no rubbish. There is freedom.
Dear Professor, I couldn't wish better promotion than this final statement. I'm very grateful for your participation in this podcast, and I look forward to our future cooperation. Thank you very much for being with us.
Bardzo dziękuję.
Ladies and gentlemen, I thank you all, and let's continue our cooperation.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for listening to us with the participation of Minister Czarnek, professor of the University of Lublin, the Catholic University of Lublin. Please continue to following our episodes here in the Central European Legal Insights. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Central European Legal Insights. Don't forget to follow us on our social media channels for updates. To discover more conversations from the series, be sure to explore our other episodes. Thank you for listening.